There are roughly 5.3 million Americans living with Alzheimer's disease. That number nearly triples by the year 2050. How can a community improve treatment, quality of life, and address the cost of health care? We rethink dementia on West Michigan Week. And thank you for joining us on West Michigan Week. I'm joined by Mina Breuker. She's president of Holland Home. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Joy Spahn, Regional Director, Alzheimer's Association of West Michigan. Joy Edward Cannon, CEO, ClearPath Choices. Good to see you.
Thank you.
And Casey Montgomery, Vice President of Marketing, Clark Retirement Community. Good to see you too.
Good to see you.
Well, we're all here because recently there was, in essence, a national dementia summit held here in Grand Rapids. It was at MSU's Secchia Center. I had the privilege of being there, and much like this table, there was a representation of so many people involved in the community trying to address this health issue that is only, as we've seen by the year 2050, it's not going to get better, it's only going to get worse. So, take me back to when everybody got together and what that was like, just to meet with people and maybe discussing the issues that you might have within your own organizations, but how it impacts others and how you all might be able to help each other out.
Well, it's really interesting. It's something that is new in healthcare in the last 3 to 5 years, and that is collaboration. And all of us here do a little different piece of dementia care, support, those types of things. But to really bring all those people together to have that discussion was really key and exciting.
We talk about stakeholders. Who was there? Give me a sense of the landscape of people there who deal with this every day.
Well, we had a little of everybody there. You had people from the government. Debbie Stabenow did a wonderful piece for us. We had all the national speakers that are have really leading and spearheading the movement in memory and dementia around the nation to come here. But we had industry leaders, attorneys, business philanthropy there, caregivers there. Anybody who would be touched or impacted by Alzheimer's or dementia was there, and that was the purpose. Is we wanted to have a good cross section of people around our community, because it doesn't just affect the people that work in it on a daily basis. It affects all of us. We're going to have more and more loved ones that we're going to be taking care of. Businesses are going to have to really look at what they're doing from their employee standpoint, because caregiving is going to be much more effective to them, and they're going to have to find a way to deal with a lot of these people.
Let's go around the table. We'll just pick up with you, Casey. What does Clark Retirement do, and how is it involved with Alzheimer's?
Well, Clark Retirement Community is what we call CCRC, which is a continuing care retirement community, which means that we have a number of type of retirement things, anything from basic independent living to assisted living to skilled nursing, home care, hospice. So as you move and you age, you go through that. Now, memory and dementia is something we're very passionate about. We have 2 locations, and both of them deal with memory and dementia in many different arenas, very much similar to what Holland Home does as well. And so we're dealing with it in the trenches, if you will, on a daily basis, where we're dealing with those that do have memory and dementia. But we're also dealing with people with caregivers every single day, the family members. That might even be the bigger challenge of when we're dealing with a disease state. So. Yeah, Clark does it the whole. We're the ones that take care of them within a facility and even in the community as well.
And Cheryl at ClearPath Choices?
Yes, what we do is help families who are struggling with care for elderly people. We help them navigate some of those challenges by providing a customized plan that will address their specific needs.
And Joy, you really cover all of it.
Yeah, we're kind of the umbrella. So yeah, we work with actually all of the community partners, both long-term care as well as other resources within the community. And we're really fortunate in West Michigan that we have a variety of services and supports for older adults and caregivers and folks with dementia. And I think that the summit really was trying to get at not just the person with the diagnosis, but also the caregiver issues and that sort of thing. Because in order to make our community more sensitive and more aware of what's going on, we first need to understand a little bit about about the person and their journey, because oftentimes we think of someone with dementia when it's more in the advanced stages, when somebody's requiring a great deal of assistance and care, but it starts much earlier than that. It starts way many, many years before you actually start seeing signs and symptoms. And by helping families and by helping the community, businesses, other organizations be aware of how early that process begins and what kinds of things to look for and how to be sensitive to the needs of that person, but also some of the caregiver journeys, because the majority of folks are taken care of at home until they're not able to do that anymore, and then oftentimes they'll reach out to programs like Carol's or long-term care and that sort of thing to help them along maybe that last part of that journey. So being aware of that and understanding the impact that it has on our community as a whole. We also need to look at how it impacts individuals. So for example, women often take a little bit harder hit financially and socially and emotionally, and that's not picking one or the other, but that's just the reality of the statistics of the caregiver. And the reason that I say that is because a lot of times females wind up leaving their employment early or cutting back to part-time so that they can be available for those parents or spouses to help in that caregiver journey. But down the road, maybe when it's time for them to look at collecting Social Security or things like that, their income has been impacted, so their available income when they may need it is diminished or less than what it could have been if they would have stayed employed full-time. So there's a whole scope of things, and what we're finding is that the disease touches everything. It's a family, it's a community issue, and the whole point, I think, of bringing the experts and the local folks and the legislative folks together was to identify and make a statement about what kinds of things we need to do to make our community more sensitive and more progressive. Grand Rapids has a history of being very collaborative, like Mina was saying, and forward thinking. And I think the things that have been happening with our medical mile and the different other types of programs and research kinds of things that are coming in. Michigan State now has some of their research centered here that focuses on Alzheimer's disease. So we have a community that really is priming itself in an excellent spot to start taking this to the next step.
The disease itself, what is it? How does it affect the body? Who's the scientist here who can?
I'm not. I'm not the scientist, but I can answer that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So when it affects the body, I mentioned that it starts early, and oftentimes people will notice things like the forgetfulness piece, because that's one of the first things that starts to notice. And that's a little bit more than just forgetting where you put your car keys and that sort of thing. So it starts interfering with an ability to do day-to-day kinds of things. And just to clarify, oftentimes I'll ask folks when I'm teaching classes and things like that for people to tell me what the difference between Alzheimer's disease and dementia, because that always comes up. The language is used interchangeably. And dementia, there's no disease called dementia. Dementia is an umbrella term that describes symptoms. So forgetfulness, changes in mood and behavior, and all those other things that we've been talking about. There are over 80 things that can cause dementia. Alzheimer's disease is the number one. It accounts for about 70% of all dementias. There's other things like vascular dementia and Lewy body dementia that have some uniquenesses to them as well. But basically what happens is all of these diseases are progressive, and that they occur over a period of time. And particularly with something like Alzheimer's disease, which is very insidious and can take 20, 30 years to actually start to show signs and symptoms of something that requires much more assistance and much more care, we're looking at how that progression and how those stages can impact all of the things that I talked about earlier in terms of family dynamics and economics and resources in the community and that sort of thing.
Locally, how many, I'm sorry, go ahead, Mina.
I was just going to say, that's why it's so key for the training that we look at for staff. Not only the empathy, understanding, getting a little insight, what it's like to have a dementia diagnosis, but what can they expect with those signs and symptoms, and then how to approach those folks, because each one is different. And so it's really key to understand that individual, what they were like prior to their dementia diagnosis can also help. And so that is one of the things we focus very strongly on is that training, and not only for our staff, but family members, and I'm sure, Cheryl, you've seen that with caregivers as well.
Oh, absolutely. The kind of preparation that's required for caregivers is unlimiting. My mother was diagnosed about 17 years ago with dementia. We lost her in February, and it was a slow progression. Verbal came much later in her diagnosis, but we would go through a period of I'm not getting dressed today. I'm not going to eat today. And I'm going to be defiant. I'm going to be in my no phase. Well, the caregiver has to figure out a way to be able to navigate that in order to provide the continued care. So, you know, dementia people need to eat. So how do you do that? They need to take their meds. How do you do that? So you get into really playing games with them. And there's a lot of stories that I have with my mom about how we got her to do those things. So our organization will help coach people and give them kind of ideas and try this method, try that. Remain patient, remain vigilant, remain in control. But you have to be creative in order to find a way to get them to do the things that are in their best interest.
Since your mother was diagnosed and she was experiencing it, early on did she know that she was diagnosed, and did she have an understanding of what was taking place?
She knew that something was different. She kept telling me, Cheryl, something is not right up here. She kept touching her head. Something is wrong up here. But I think her progression into not knowing at all was quick, and I think that's a blessing in itself. It's when your diagnosed person struggles with trying to remember and they get frustrated. She didn't go through that, but I've seen other people suffer that way.
So by saying no, though, obviously there is a thought process and some type of control taking place, right? Because they want to control the situation.
Right.
So it's just the neuroscience there is fascinating to me.
Absolutely.
Even though maybe memories and things aren't quite there, there's still people who
Right.
do have control of themselves and the functionality.
And they could be saying no and not knowing what they're saying no to.
Oh, okay. All right.
You know, that's probably more the
Yeah, I
reality.
was going to say, what happens is, you know, the different parts of the brain control different functions. So I always tell folks, think of dementia more like a spider web, because every single thing that we do is based on learning. We don't come into this world with this whole preset of skills like dressing ourselves and toileting ourselves and knowing how to drive cars or whatever. Those are processes that we learn. And Alzheimer's disease and these other dementias, what they do is they little by little, as they impact different parts of the brain, begin to interfere with connecting information. So for example, I worked with a gentleman one time that was trying to put his shoes on. He knew what his shoes were, he knew what his feet were, he had no idea how to get him on his feet. So what it does is it interferes with the person's ability to plan. And when I talk about that, I'm talking about say you're going to go visit Aunt Mary later in the day. Well, the person may not make the connection between how you're going to get there or what that means to go visit somebody if they remember that person. And again, this is later in the disease process. But what it does is it begins to interfere with the person's ability to connect pieces of information together. So meaning for one word may change. Sometimes people start using words that are not related. And when you talk about reasoning and logic and that kind of thing, it's not the same as what we would be thinking about it. It turns out to be more of because the person doesn't understand the consequences or doesn't understand what the outcome of that's going to be. They're not able to look into the future, so to speak. So, for example, for us to be here, there was some planning that needed to take place in order for us to be here on time, and the expectation and that sort of thing. Someone with dementia, as their disease progresses, loses the ability to anticipate what those kinds of things mean. So they might mean that, yes, we're going to go down to the college, but making the connection between going to the college and being on a program would be totally different. So putting those pieces of information, and that it turns out to be one of the really challenging things for families, because we're, you know, over years we develop a way of communicating and interacting with folks, and because the diseases for the most part are so slow and insidious, like what you were mentioning too, is we continue to relate to the person the same way, but the person's abilities and being able to relate back have changed significantly. So it's difficult to shift and to know what to do and how to do it. So training both for the professional caregiver but also the family caregiver is hugely important. We're not, you know, we don't have a lot of experience with this. Most of the time folks that are caregivers, whether it's a professional or whether it's a family caregiver, this may be the first time that they're dealing with this kind of thing. And it's not like a physical disability where you can see what the injury is. It's an injury of the brain, and so we haven't adjusted our expectations of what that person's abilities are. We continue to relate to them in a way that we expect them to act a certain way, the way that they did before they developed the disease. And now with this disease process, it's a whole different bag of worms in terms of relearning how to relate. And it's fluid, so you might learn how to deal with one phase, and then before you know it, you've moved into the next one, and so you have to continually adjust what you're doing.
Well, even I've seen it where the person who has dementia will also have moments where they're very alert, oriented, and everything makes sense. So it's very frustrating to the family because one minute when I have this conversation, we're connecting, and the next we're not. Why not? And so to really support those caregivers and families of understanding and the patience that it takes is very important.
Well, and I would imagine for children, these are parents who you've known for decades, and you look up to them in a certain light, and then to see somebody deteriorate, it, as you said, it requires patience.
Or change behavior. Mom has never been like this. My mom has been calm and quiet, and now she's outgoing and behaving in a way I've never seen it. There's guilt, there's embarrassment, there's anger, a lot of feelings that the caregivers, the families go through. And that is where I think reaching out for help is so key for family members not to feel they're alone on this journey. There is help out there. There's multiple resources, and that's one of the things we talked about at the summit. How do we make the awareness of the disease and awareness of the resources and access easier for everyone in our community?
All right, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll continue rethinking dementia in just 1 minute. We're back with more West Michigan Week. We've been discussing dementia and the impacts, and specifically Alzheimer's disease. Casey, the data, the numbers, how many people in this area are affected by Alzheimer's?
Tens of thousands. I think I made the equivalent if you were to just take Kent County alone. You could take the people who are dealing with dementia, and then you take those caregivers, and all the arenas that we have here in the area would fill them up, and there would be many, many people outside those doors. So if you just go to Van Andel alone, we can fill that just with people dealing with memory and dementia. And it's only going to get worse. We've got the baby boomers we all talk about that are coming, and we know that the rates are extremely high. But we also see a kind of a trend right now too, as they're getting younger and younger, as they're getting diagnosed, and we're seeing Joy had mentioned 80 different types, and some of the newer ones are much more aggressive, and they take on a little bit quicker pathway, and so people aren't as prepared. And so we're not just dealing with people who are in their 80s and 90s. We're dealing with people sometimes in their 40s and their 50s who are in prime working age, who are spouses and children that are going through school. And so we're seeing a new dynamic now of how to work with these new types of people we're seeing, and we're all learning, I think, from this right now, and which is another main reason why we brought the summit here, because we're trying to be, as we all said, proactive. We know it's coming. We know we've got a problem. As Grand Rapids has always done, we're going to take care of our own. We're going to take care of West Michigan. Grand Rapids is not just Grand Rapids. We look at West Michigan as a whole, and what can we do to get ahead of it? And I think this is the first step. We're going to get ahead of it.
Some of the dominoes here. So for every patient diagnosed with Alzheimer's, how many caregivers are required?
It really depends. It depends on the abilities of that person, but they say anywhere from 3 to 5 people per person who has dementia is affected. So if there are 10,000 people in Kent County right now with that diagnosis, that's 30 to 50,000 caregivers on top of the 10,000. So there's a burden there. And as the disease progresses and their abilities decrease, the caregiving needs increase.
So you have the 10,000, the 30 to 50,000. Some of those caregivers are family members. There are impacts then when it comes to employment. People having difficulty holding a job, and then impacting employers who need those bodies 8, 9, 10 hours a day.
Absolutely. I would say dementia is everyone's business. It impacts, it's a social, economic issue.
Absolutely. Some of the things that we coach families on is to be prepared, no matter what is ahead. We coach people on preparing their financial future. The cost alone is staggering. So when we meet with families, you need to know where the money is. You need to know about how much money is going to be needed as you go through this process. You need to qualify yourself into insurance plans when you can. You need to look at the legal aspects. Who's going to have control of all of this as you progress through this as a family unit? And then ultimately, we take them through an exercise to do some pre-funeral planning. And that's an interesting conversation. This will reduce some of the stresses and the conflicts that the caregivers are going to face ultimately. There's a data point that I saw the other day that there's roughly 44 million households with about 23 million caregivers in charge or employed for that. That's a staggering number to me. And it's going to, as Casey has said, it's going to just accelerate in the next decade or so.
What are the big picture costs? What are we seeing? I mean, we're talking billions of dollars.
Billions.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it depends if there's care at home opportunities. First of all, there's the family. There's not a financial cost that they pay them, but there's a financial cost if they can't work any longer, those types of things. But then if you have caregivers at home, that can range from $18 an hour to $25 an hour. If you go into a facility where you need help, those range anywhere from $2,000 to $3,000 a month to $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 a month at end stage in a skilled nursing. That's a lot of money. And so how do you prepare for that? I think, though, one of the keys is, like you said, Cheryl, that planning. And I would encourage everyone to check out Making Choices Michigan. Before someone gets too far down in the disease or progressing, what do they want at end of life? What are their wishes? Have those conversations now before you can't have them, so that they can make choices about their destiny.
Caregivers spend roughly over $10,000 a year when the resident or the patient is at home.
So out of pocket.
Out of pocket.
Yeah.
So that's going to be maybe toiletries. It could be food. It could be clothing. It could be prescriptions, if they're prescription drugs, if there's no coverage for that. So when you get to a point of spending over $50,000, like Mina said, it's more in organized care, like a Clark retirement or a Holland home. It's staggering. So when we share that with families, their hair almost bursts into flames because they haven't thought about the cost aspect, and it's just going to be, my parents planned accordingly, and that helped me a lot.
It helps us a lot to take care of people for places like Holland Home and Clark. We're often seen more as a crisis state, and when it gets crisis, it's very difficult to start planning those things now because people aren't thinking clearly, and they're not understanding exactly where they're headed and where they need it, and they're trying to find paperwork. The crisis thing is the worst, but we see it every day where people just need help right now. And again, going back to the summit, we're trying to get ahead of this a little bit. We're trying to be that place in the United States that says, Grand Rapids has got it together.
Joy, any sense of, at the end of the summit, were there some conclusions? Was some headway made, or was it a starting point?
I think it was both. I think the fact that we were able to pull this together and have such a wonderful response at the table was great. We had, like Casey said, legislators, they have to be there. The legislators have to be there. There has to be advocacy efforts to make this move forward. But I think it was it was helpful to bring people together so that there's this unified understanding so that we can have this collective effort moving forward. And having the professionals and the folks that we did come in that presented and spoke and things like that were really helpful because it gave us a chance to see what kinds of things were being done in other parts of the community or other parts of the country.
And the research will continue as well,
Absolutely.
especially here in Grand Rapids. Mina Breuker, President, Holland Home, thank you so much. Joy Spahn, Regional Director, Alzheimer's Association of West Michigan, thank you. Cheryl Edwards-Cannon, CEO, Clear Path Choices, thank you. And Casey Montgomery, Vice President, Marketing, Clark Retirement Community, thank you so much.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us this week. We'll see you next week on West Michigan Week.